Hello and welcome to International Relations with Professor Pushpesh Pant. This is a weekly podcast which we curate especially for the aspirants of the civil service examinations. What we intend to do is to take up a topic, analyze the background, discuss the issues involved, mention the individuals who are important, and try to analyze how all these events they interact on India's national interest and our foreign policy. This time, what we intend to discuss with you is G20 Summit, which India is hosting towards the end of this year. Ever since the presidency or the chair of G20 passed on to India late last year, there has been great excitement about the event. Thanks to Prime Minister Modi, who with his great event management skills has taken it to a different level altogether. So far, whenever a G20 summit took place, it was confined to that particular month, at the most that particular, if not that particular week, and the host country treated it as a routine event. But what Mr. Modi has done, he has uplifted this and accepted the challenge of positioning India at the high table of international relations by saying that he intends to make G20 the voice of the South. Now, the voice of the South is an interesting concept which has come back after a number of years. Earlier, there was a division between the developed world and the developing world. It was the North and the South. But this was way back in the late 20th century. There also was a division, ideological division of the world between East and West. And at times, these two segmentations intersected. But it was generally understood that the developed North, with the exclusion of China, which was in the Northern Hemisphere, did not belong to the same world where the developing world, most of the developing world was concentrated, the lower half of the hemisphere. Now, this dichotomy has always plagued international relations, particularly during the Cold War, where the East-West ideological conflict tended to overshadow everything else, and problems of South were not looked over. They were overlooked all the time. Now, what Mr. Modi has done, that he has said that India, which used to be the champion advocate of the Afro-Asian nations in the non-aligned movement, when non-aligned movement was at its zenith during the Cold War and had played a very important role in bringing down temperatures and acting for peace, India can resume this role. Mr. Modi, we may remember, has been talking about India becoming a Vishwaguru, India providing the lead in technology, India providing the lead in climate change negotiations, India providing the lead in vaccine maitri, India using its soft power for the good of the mankind. All this has been happening. The opportunity was right when the chair passed in Bali to India, because it's a very interesting situation. Just before Indonesia, the summit had taken place in Italy, and that was very much part of the developed world. And when India took it over, Mr. Modi knew very well that after India, it would pass over to Brazil, another developing country in the southern hemisphere. So there would be a continuity from Indonesia to India to Brazil, and then to South Africa, where issues of the third, what was once referred to as the third world, which was referred to the South, the global South, would again be in the sharp focus. What provided this opportunity, some people thought that he was exaggerating, but we should give him due credit for grasping an opportunity which was very rare. This was a time when the Ukraine war had brought international structures under great strain. There was the economic sanctions imposed on Russia. Putin was determined not to bend down, nor was NATO willing to be browbeaten by Putin's bullying. According to them, it was bullying, and the special military operation, which some people had thought would end early, had taken almost a year. So there was a stalemate, and the United Nations Security Council, thanks to its archaic Jurassic structure, had failed to play any meaningful role in this. At the same time, people were looking at India, which had good relationship with the United States of America, Russia. With China, its relationship is fraught, but the trade with China has increased despite the border tensions, despite the COVID pandemic. So people expected India to play a role commensurate with its size. Let's also not forget that India is become the largest populated nation in the world. It is either the fifth or the sixth. The jostling for the place keeps changing, musical chairs between India and United Kingdom, but it is one of the large economies in the first 10, most certainly. So fifth, sixth, seventh, the gap is very little. The gap between India and the first three economies is much larger, but that doesn't matter. India is a populous nation. India has vast area under its uh, control. India also has economic might, which earlier it was not there. India has technological prowess in almost all fields of state-of-the-art science and technology. So all these things combined to give Mr. Modi an opportunity to say that he would try to make the G20 the voice of the South. Some people were skeptical, some people were doubting Thomas's. They always said that what would happen after a year? After a year, India would no longer be the champion. India would no longer be the president of the G20. But I think there's a mistake there. If India gathers enough traction and maintains the momentum, India would have taken a lead in various multilateral negotiations in other fora, and India would continue to be taken very, very seriously by subsequent chairs of the G20. So I think this is what we intend to have a closed look this time. And like always, let's begin at the beginning. We have tried to keep it short and sweet, focused for the UPSC examination preparation. There has been a lot of a media campaign about G20 Summit in India. What is interesting is that India is going to have year-long events almost every month in different parts of the country. Some people would have again been criticizing this as tourism promotion or projecting an image, but let's not forget that this gives a sense of achievement to Indian people almost in all parts of the country and gives them a sense of identifying with the G20 activities which are taking place. So is G20 really going to become the voice of the global South? That is something which we have to look. And for that, a short historical review and a look at the factual data is very necessary. What is G20? Now, G20 brings together 20 largest economies in the world that account for 85% of the global GDP, gross domestic product, and over 75% of the international, that is global trade. About 2/3 of the world's population is represented. So on the face of it, it is the most important forum, multilateral forum, where negotiations can take place. It has a tricontinental footprint. It doesn't distinguish between North and South. All the G7 countries, G7 plus 8 till Russia was there, the developed countries were there, are included in it. It includes the most important developing countries in the world. It also has certain other countries which may be smaller in size, smaller in economy, but are significant geopolitically invited. There also is a provision in G20 of having special invitees. So this, to our mind, very rightly, as the Indian Prime Minister has tried to project, is the most important forum of the future, keeping in mind the repeated failures and stalemate and policy paralysis, not only of the United Nations Security Council and General Assembly, but also of organs like International Monetary Fund, Bank of Reconstruction and Development International. And there is, because they are one way or the other, Security Council decides what can be followed up in IMF or IBRD or in World Court. These things make it very, very interesting. The promise and potential of G20 is quite large. Let's have a look at it. The membership and functioning of, you can see G7, G7 plus 1, G8 is included, and then there's Argentina, Australia, we have Brazil, we have China, we have European Union, the cluster of all states in Europe, we have India, we have Indonesia, we have South Korea, we have Mexico, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Japan, and we have Italy, we have Turkey. Now, so you see it is pretty representative of countries and actors that matter in international relations. If you have a look at the world map, it becomes very clear that the G20 members are spread all across the globe. They represent all continents. And as you can see on this, it includes anybody who's a significant actor in contemporary international relations. Obviously, the big gaps are in the African continent, and the other open spaces you see are the Iceland, where there is population density is very thin. So besides being unfair to Africa, this organization seems to be pretty well represented. The exclusion of Africa is understandable because this is primarily economic grouping, and the economic activity being very, very retarded in Africa is not being there. Another thing about the membership and the functioning of the G20, which we must remember, is that it is not a permanent organization with a secretariat or a staff of its own. It is not being based on a treaty. It started off as a very informal grouping. The group's chair rotates annually among the members and is elected from a different region every time. And what happens is that the incumbent chair provides for a temporary secretariat for the duration of the term and coordinates the group's activities. This informality has its advantages, but it also has its shortcomings. So from Italy to Bali to Indonesia to India, there is a tenuous continuity if the host countries have a relationship which is close and cordial, extraordinarily close and cordial. I must say that all other countries also have good relationships, but then it is facilitated the work of G20. Now let's have a look at the significance of G20. It was established at a particularly distressing time when the world was experiencing a global financial crisis. The G7, G8, and the Bretton Woods systems had proved to be unable to provide financial stability. After the global economic crisis and financial crisis of 2007, this G20 was upgraded to a level of heads of state of governments in 2009. Before that, it only was finance ministers, presidents of the central bank, and then it became a premier forum for international economic deliberations and cooperations. It breaks away from the United Security Council format of P5, where members have a veto power. Nobody has a veto power here, but generally it is agreed that there would be decisions arrived at consensus. This is a good thing, but at times it leads to any lack of agreement, as it is appearing this time in India, in the Finance Ministers' Conference, in the Foreign Ministers' Conference. No joint communique could be declared at the end of the meeting. Because of the Ukraine war, there were sharp differences, and even the words which had been used in Bali, like war and invasion, were not allowed this time by Russia and China, who dug in their heels. This chart would give you an idea of the numbers, and you can see that the two large population numbers are, of course, China and India. So two most populous nations in the world are in this thing. They might be having differences among themselves, but on various issues, from climate to development to equitable distribution of access to markets, they are in agreement. And if you see the more influential members of the Security Council, pale in insignificance in terms of population. So if you come in, this numbers game is important, because it also shows that how a minuscule population of the developed nations has appropriated for itself decision making in international relations. It claims the resources of the world, the non-renewable resources, non-replenishable resources, and how because of their consumption pattern, their carbon footprint may appear low when it comes to at the national level, but at the per capita level, individual level, they are probably the greatest polluters. Now, this again is G22 in numbers. This time the numbers are not referring to population, but referring to area. Here again, you see Russia overshadows everyone else. Canada comes next, then is United States. But Canada doesn't punch much above its weight. It probably does much less than it is capable of because of a special relationship with United States of America. So the United States of America dominates the North American continent. So if you see United States of America and Canada, they jointly have area which is comparable to what Russia individually has. And then you have China, pretty high up. Then you have Brazil. Then you have Australia, and Australia is something in a similar situation like Canada. It might be a country which is a continent, but it only plays a role in international affairs because of its alliances with the developed Western world, its military treaties which had signed during the Cold War, and it depends still for its security essentially to its relationship with the West, with the United Kingdom, with France, although at times the relationship is fraught, as was recently brought out when the nuclear submarines deal was cancelled with France, shifted to United Kingdom. But Australia belongs very much to the developed world, racially, culturally, and by its treaty alliances. Now, when you come to other countries, India is an online country which is an extremely interesting situation where the population is large, the area under its control is among the first top 10 countries, and it is independent, autonomous in its worldview. The others, again, as you see, pale into insignificance in terms of on this scale. Now, this is the GDP numbers. I mean, all these numbers are not necessarily coincide. Here again, you see the towering figures are the largest economies. It is the United States of America, it is China, comes down. That's where India is somewhere in the 5th or the 6th spot, depending on when the statistics have been published, but others you see are insignificant. So many of the so-called big powers of Europe, who had played an important role in history, in diplomatic history, till the Second World War, do not have the economic clout. The first 5 economies, again, you see China and Japan overshadow the ones which we are used to accepting as developed countries, powerful countries. One interesting question that is raised here is about the influence and accountability of this grouping. The G20's prominent membership gives it a strong input on global policy, but besides providing this input, can it also ensure that its advice is heeded to, some action is taken? There are outstanding disputes about the legitimacy of G20 because it is not a treaty-based organization. It doesn't have an official status. It is an organization which raises a challenge to the United Nations and its importance. So efficacy of its declarations is suspect. There is no formal charter, and the most important meetings are closed door. So some people have also criticized the lack of transparency. In recent times, this lack of transparency is giving way to more open transactions, because if no joint communique is agreed upon, eyebrows are raised, speculations are made, and there are meetings among important people, leaders at the sidelines of the meetings, and lot of what transpired comes out into the open. There is deliberate leaks. There is a part of the psychological pressure building. I think the greatest criticism is what we pointed out when we were having a look at the map, the underrepresentation of African countries and the practice of inviting observers from non-member states as a symbolic tokenism, a concession to the margins, raises doubts about the grouping's truly representative legitimacy. We might add here that making everybody a member would nullify the whole raison d'etre of G20. It is an economic forum, so the size of economies of countries who are members should matter. It is claiming to talk for the whole of the global south. So like in representative democracy, it is not necessary for everybody to be directly present as long as they have a trustworthy representative giving voice to their aspirations. So this is what India did during the Afro-Asian Solidarity movement, during the non-line movement at the height of the Cold War. Since then, also since the decline of the Soviet Union and its dissolution, India has played an important role. It may not have been as important role or recognized as such as it was in the non-line movement, but the fact remains that India this time also has invited Egypt, India has invited Nigeria, and India has, of course, South Africa is itself a member. So let's see whether this criticism can be very soon answered. We have had a look at the significance of G20. We have had a look at its structure, its informal operating procedures, and so on. It probably, and we have also, of course, noted its global spread. But I think it is necessary to keep in mind the contentious issues which divide the meetings, members of the meetings of G20. In March 2022, there was an instance when, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the US president called for the removal of Russia from the group. It was not formally done. It could not be formally done because there is no charter, no such provision of kicking a member out. Alternatively, the US president suggested that the president of Ukraine should be invited to the meeting as an aggrieved party of an aggressor if any progress is to be made. So there was an attempt at politicization of a purely economic forum. It cannot be said it was totally unjustified because due to the war, economic sanctions have been imposed on Russia. It had been kicked out of the international banking system, and certain important industrialists or politicians had been targeted and sanctioned again. There has been also an ongoing trade war against the Chinese ever since President Trump's presidency. So one could argue that these issues were very much related to the substantial concerns of G20. So Zelensky was invited to Bali. He made a virtual presence, made an impassioned speech, etc. Russia obviously is at that stage was not bothered about this. The war was not going on very much in Russia's favor. It was meeting with setbacks, and Russia could not care less because as many of the developed members of the G20 or the G7 members who had expelled Russia formally from the G7+1 gathering had imposed sanctions against it. And expelling Russia from the grouping or making it even informally difficult for them to attend, according to China, would make it counterproductive. No progress could be made on any negotiations. It would be a clear-cut divide between the members. During the 2022 summit, President Zelensky appeared in a video statement, and this joint statement, which was issued after the summit, did mention to the Russian invasion and the war. Interestingly, these words have become unacceptable to Russia and China, who have dug in their heels. Partly the reason is that in the intervening period, the war has taken another pendulum-like swing. Russians have not registered a decisive victory, but the counteroffensive is doing substantially better than their war so far over the past 1 year. The towns, villages recaptured by the Ukrainians have been under great pressure. Some of them, the Ukrainian forces have retreated from. They have advised the civilians to move out, and they are abandoning these targets. So partisan warfare in these territories continues, but Russians and the Chinese have dug in their heels for a long war of attrition, and they are no longer prepared to accept any criticism. Now, let's see where that leaves India and the G20. We mentioned before that Indonesia, from Indonesia, the chair passes to India, it passes to Brazil. So it is logical to believe that the concerns of the global south would remain important. This would mean that for 3 years in a row, the focus of deliberations will prioritize if politics doesn't overshadow all this. Consolidated numbers of these three nations, the economy is USA is 6.6 trillion, population is 1.8 billion, and it still is over anybody else. India has always advocated substantial reform in the UN. Little progress has been made. So from Indian point of view, if it can give a new direction to G20, it will presumably continue to be the leading voice of the global south, regardless of who the president is. Brazil is a continuity. After Brazil, it will come to South Africa, as we noticed before. But it is an exciting prospect if the discussion can shift from an almost impossible structural reform in United Nations, almost paralyzed United Nations, to a body which can exert its influence. It may be an informal body, it may not have a formal structure, resources on its own, but it can build up a momentum in other fora. One instance is, while this time in the finance ministers' meeting at G20, no joint agreement could be signed. In the foreign ministers' agreement, no general agreement could be signed. But on the sidelines, the Quad's foreign ministers met, and they took a more concrete, specific stance, which the Americans, the Australians, would find it much more conducive to what their stance is. Interestingly, India has continued playing a tightrope walk. India has not yielded to the pressure, but India has not been able to persuade its friend Russia or the adversary with which it has a very substantial economic relationship to come midway and at least accept a conciliatory position, a resilient position about where to go on from here. India's year-long activities would reach a climax in the summit in November 2023. Till that time, India has ample opportunity of leveraging its chair in the G20 into other meetings. The other summit is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, which will take place in June, July. There might be foreign ministers' meetings with other nations taking place in between. Also, let us not forget that the organization of the G20 Summit will come in later in November, but till then, Indian External Affairs Ministry will lose no opportunity to organize events to bring high-ranking diplomats from other member countries to India and try to work on some kind of an agreement, some kind of a rapprochement with the adversaries at the moment, Russia and China, who don't seem to be in a very cooperative mood. G20 is allowing the resurrection of the NAM, the non-aligned movement, to India, which allowed many countries in the late 20th century to come out and confront the larger powers. So it is not necessary to adopt an adversarial posture. It is not necessary that we should measure everything with the UN votes, because the UN votes don't make any difference to anybody anywhere. So, and we may talk of, but so more substantial issues of global politics, which are global concerns, whether it is looming climate catastrophe, whether it is a threat of the international terrorism, whether it is cooperation in the field of technology, whether it is discussion of human rights, all these are issues which remain important. And I think bargaining as a group with the developed nations has far greater potential for success than anything else. So preparing the ground for other diplomatic interactions in other multilateral fora, even if G20 doesn't immediately in coming years become the alternative United Nations, it has the prospect of influencing negotiations at other more formal fora. There are two quotes by the Minister of External Affairs, S. Jaishankar, which sum up India's current position. Sometime Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problem are the world's problem, and world's problem are not Europe's problem. He also was more blunt when he said, if I were to take Europe collectively, it has been singularly silent on many things which are happening. For example, in Asia, why not talk about the aggressive designs of China vis-a-vis India, or in South China Sea area, or the problems of refugees, or the problems of level playing field being provided to them to enter markets, whether it is America, whether it is Europe. So it would say that you could ask why anybody in Asia should trust Europe or anything at all. So I think these are blunt statements, but he's been always hard-talking diplomat with great subtlety when it is required, but he doesn't stop short of calling a spade anytime. So India's role, the government of India has coined the slogan for the meet, one earth, one family, one future. The essence is inspired by a Sanskrit shlok, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the whole world is a family. So which implies three things. That A, when we talk of one earth, we are not talking of world which has a political focus, which is the country-wise, nation-state-wise focus. So when we talk of one earth, we are talking of planet, we are talking of biodiversity, we are talking of climate change and how it impinges on biodiversity. We are talking in terms of all living beings having an interrelationship, the ecological crisis which might loom, and also the hazards of global problems which have to be shared by a consensus. They cannot be shared by a few developing countries to their own interest, whether energy security, food security, terrorism, pandemics, all this is one earth treated as one family and also common problems. So the future is one future because our existence as a race, our survival as a planet uh, depends on recognizing that unless we commit ourselves to a shared future, nothing can be achieved. The Indian Prime Minister has repeatedly asserted that the summit should address common concerns. We mentioned before climate, international terrorism, equitable financial system, monetary arrangements, and this certainly will help India assert itself at the SCO, where it is at a disadvantage. It is at a disadvantage now at the moment with growing proximity between China and Russia. And also Pakistan also is a member there. The Central Asian republics are not exactly entirely independent and autonomous strategically. Politics there seems to be particularly volatile. The distance and connectivity are a problem. So what comes to mind is that SCO, which seemed at one stage an interesting forum to use Russia as a countervailing factor in India's relations with China, the scenario has changed totally. The war in Ukraine has brought Russia and China closer than ever before. Some people even suggest that Russia at the moment is willing to accept the junior partner's role to get rid of the Western challenge and to contribute towards the decline of the West more actively. So, but China is not quite willing to accept this responsibility immediately, because China is ingratiated into the Western economic system far more than Russia was. Russia's involvement with Europe was energy security. It had never seriously, ever since Putin took place, accepted a cooperative role with the West. Not only Putin is to blame, I think the arrogance of the American establishment, which thought that after the decline of Soviet Union, they had won the Cold War, the history had ended, and America was the unipolar hyperpower, and it did not need any other power to share its global role. It would dictate its will on the rest of the world. Maybe constructively thinking that is good for the rest of the world, imposing democracy from top, intervening unilaterally in conflicts. And I think Putin had been provoked to a great extent to adopt a pugnacious posture. So let's keep that in mind. But here, without taking sides, one can say that Russia and China have drawn closer to India's disadvantage. So SCO does not have the same promise for India at the moment than it had in the past. At the same time, Pakistan, despite the aid, its dependency on aid from Islamic fraternity and America, is so much under the pressure of Chinese that it also is in that camp where China, Iran, Russia are there with Pakistan. So this constellation is not right for India, but if India can assert itself in G20, then of course SCO becomes far less significant strategically for India, and India can take its diplomacy elsewhere. India has managed to forego the differences that plague organizations like BRICS, SCO, and UN. We have mentioned SCO, we have talked about UN. BRICS again is interesting. If you see the BRICS, which was once considered to be the voice of the South, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. In this also, Russia and China overshadow other members. South Africa is not in a very good shape, despite its being counted as a developed nation, its industrial potential, its per capita income, the political instability, law and order, problem of race relationship. And it has not been able to assume the role which was assigned to it throughout the mid-20th century, that it would become the natural leader after apartheid ends of the whole of Africa. It has not happened. Corruption plagues its politics. Society is in great turmoil. The divide, the great, sharp, painful divide between the haves and have-nots is there. And I think the whites and the Western multinational corporations continue to control the economic resources. So even BRICS is not something which would interest India as much. Maybe G20 gives India the opportunity to collaborate more constructively, more meaningfully with Brazil as well as South Africa and continue the task here. there are other multilateral fora which have come up, Quad, which we referred to a little earlier, that how when there is a stalemate at the G20, at the Foreign Ministers Conference or the Finance Ministers Conference, India could switch gears and go to Quad and pose Quad there, that India has a membership of Quad. So India can take a stand in Quad, which is not contradictory to what it is taking in G20, but it can convey to its friends like Russia and countries like China that India has not put all its eggs on the G20 basket, and they cannot throw a spanner in India's diplomacy by stalling the diplomatic campaign at the G20. The G20 works at two tracks. There is a Sherpa track and there is a finance track. Under the Sherpa track, 100 official meetings are expected to be organized on various issues that include subjects of common interest: employment, health, digital economy, trade, investment, industry, environment and climate, anti-corruption, energy, agriculture, tourism, culture, socio-economic development, education, women's empowerment. Now, of all these topics, when you look at it, listing is just counting them, but there is ample scope for India to contribute substantially to other developing nations in these fields. India can also, I mean, as has been shown, its digital payment platform has been accepted by even a country as developed technologically and financially as Singapore. Most Western countries do not have such digital private public goods as India has developed over a past decade or so. So I think whether it is vaccines, whether it is medicines, whether it is digital public goods, whether it is alternative energy resources. The Prime Minister of India was the one who stitched together the International Solar Alliance. And when it comes to relief and rehabilitation, when a natural calamity strikes a neighbor, India has been in the forefront. Now, the trouble is that politics doesn't allow India at times to project its power, both soft and hard, effectively. Like take the case of the floods in Pakistan. India should not be criticized for not coming to the aid of its neighbors. The Pakistanis had a hubris. They did not want to accept aid from India. The army did not want to give access to whom they considered an enemy. They had put obstacles in our way to provide humanitarian relief even in Afghanistan. So I think that is a very different case. But whenever it comes to a neighbor truly in need, in Sri Lanka tottering on the verge of financial bankruptcy, India has been more than willing and generous with the aid it gives, despite the fact that the government has changed only cosmetically there. The affairs are run from behind the scene by the Rajapaksa family. The Ranil Wickremesinghe is basically a puppet. And then Sri Lanka doesn't seem to be getting out of a problem because they want to impose an authoritarian rule over the people, control protests, curb the freedom of expression, and not take hard measures to hurt the rich, the super rich, the corrupt politicians, and the crisis continues. Now, something like that seems to be happening in all neighboring countries to a larger or lesser extent. But we shall discuss that, the disturbed neighborhood, economically bankrupt neighborhood, political turbulence in neighborhood, instability in another episode with you. But right now, what is interesting is that when the Sherpa track activity is taking place in G20, there can be a lot more trilateral cooperation possibilities explained. India's technical and economic assistance program has played an important role in almost 100 countries since independence. There can be collaboration between India and Brazil to help a country elsewhere. There can be a collaboration between Saudi Arabs and Indians to help somewhere else. India and Nigeria on the African continent. So I think this Sherpa track activity is no less important than the political negotiations taking place anywhere else. Leveraging India's soft power and punching above its weight, the Sherpa Amitabh Kant, the ex-CEO of Niti Aayog, is preparing ground for the summit. So some people, some doomsday callers are saying that, oh, the summit is already doomed to failure. There can't be a consensus about this war in Ukraine. But war in Ukraine has only served to put G20 in sharper focus. G20's focus does not depend. G20 was not born because of the Ukraine war. It was born of a financial crisis in Europe. It was upgraded to the heads of the state because there was a perceived need for a body of this kind, a platform of this kind. So I think it would be justified to conclude that India's role would continue in multilateral fora, especially G20, regardless of what happens in the Ukraine war theater. The FMCBG is to get rid of the clumsy formulation, long finance ministers and second meeting of central bank governors that took place in Bangalore on 22-25. The finance track is being looked after by the Foreign Secretary, ex-Foreign Secretary Shingla, who's looking after this at all. Now, the interesting thing is that these two parallel tracks do not have to intersect like parallel lines. They may travel long distances without meeting, but in the same direction. So they reinforce each other. They provide support to each other. On the Russian-Ukrainian issue, the group said that G20 is not the forum to resolve security issues and acknowledges that the security issues can have significant consequences for global economy. So you see that formulation does recognize that security issues can have significant consequences for the global economy, is stating the obvious. So the Russian-Ukrainian issue can only be shifted for terms of either negotiated peace, freezing the conflict, ceasefire, humanitarian relief. All that is some other forum. The group acknowledged the urgency to address the debt vulnerability in lower middle income countries glaring in our face: Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, South Africa, which have mismanaged their economies to an extent that their promise at one time they were supposed to be economic powerhouses is not there. The group said that it will take actions to enable enhanced financing for sustainable development goals. This again is interesting. There are millennial goals, sustainable development goals, the name changes, but every time the goal post is shifted and you find that the goals have not been met. So perhaps the time has come in fora like G20 to have a time-bound agenda, and by the next summit meeting, you say, stock taking, what we have done that. The stock taking of sustainable financial roadmap is perhaps more important than anything else. The foreign ministers meet that followed also ended without a joint communication. That was not expected after a similar not unexpected after the similar roadblock in Bengaluru. However, India remains undeterred, and India, as we mentioned earlier, immediately had on the sidelines a Quad meeting where the Indian foreign minister was much more blunt. And he said that, look, let's have this meeting. The Quads has been looked with great suspicion and apprehension by China, who thinks that it is an Asian NATO. And India is also a member of another multilateral organization, which is called the Western Quad, which is the I2U2, where India, United Arab Emirates, Israel, and United States are members. So these two quads in East and quads in West, provide India with an opportunity to let its adversaries know that they might try to stifle G20 and India's presidency. It is not going to affect it because India on the sidelines of the G20 will generate enough traction for its diplomacy to continue even after the presidency passed over to the next person. We should also not forget that it was the meeting which provided an opportunity for the Indian External Affairs Minister to meet for the first time the newly appointed Chinese foreign minister. It was a high-level meeting, and again, the Indian External Affairs Minister made it clear that he had made it obvious to his counterpart that India and China were going through a phase of abnormal relationship between their interactions. It's interesting because they have a very substantial economic relationship, but the border issue continues to be there. China's aggressive stance in South China Sea is bothering India. China's salami slicing in whether it is in Bhutan, whether it is in Myanmar, or support to a regime in Myanmar, or interference in a neighboring country like Nepal, allegedly by the Chinese ambassador, interference in the politics. India cannot remain indifferent to all these activities. So obviously, Indian displeasure, Indian anxieties have been conveyed to Chinese without an Indian External Affairs Minister have to make the trip to China, or the Chinese choosing the time and place of these negotiations. So G20 has its other utilities. We feel that at times what happens in the sidelines of these international meetings is much more important than what is taking place in the arena, the boxes. So the sidelines are as important as the main arena. And because India has interestingly calibrated the activities across the year, India gets repeated chances to do this. There was an American Secretary of State who visited India, who made great gestures by traveling in a tuk-tuk, in a three-wheeler scooter, to meet the employees of the American embassy. But it also provided him an opportunity to come face to face on the sidelines with the Russian foreign minister. So although the American foreign minister, the German foreign minister, the French foreign minister, for logistical reasons, could not attend the Indian External Affairs Minister's dinner, but they did ultimately turn up for the G20 foreign ministers meeting, and did on the sidelines meet people whom they would have avoided in a more formal setting. What we can't miss is the hard road ahead. The conclusion is inescapable that the diplomatic interactions on the sidelines of G20 meetings are going to be more significant than the diplomatic exchanges in the arena. So let us not be disappointed about the joint communique not being issued or signed. It would be worth watching closely how long can India carry on this advantage of its presidential declarations, which each member can sign some paragraphs and not sign some paragraphs. But this recognition is important, as we noted and underlined earlier, that political and security issues can impinge on economic development and financial issues, which one should carefully watch out. By now, it is clear that the Sino-Russian camp, as well as the Russian US-led Western alliance, are unwilling to see eye to eye. And although India has managed to walk a tightrope so far, it will become increasingly difficult in following days. The rigid bipolar world seems to be re-emerging again, and India would have to tread carefully. We will have to keep a sharp eye on what all can go wrong, what happens after the presidency or the chair of the G20 moves to the next country.